Welcome to Conversations. A pleasure. Welcome to the program. His title is, damn it, I got it right. It's Convention Organizer, Left Forum 2014. His name is Seth Adler. And welcome, Seth, to the set. It's so good. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and you're going to help fill us in on that Left Forum and other matters. And welcome very much to Manhattan Networking Conversations.
Thank you, Harold. And I'll go with Convention Organizer. And the Left Forum is a convention-sized conference gathering and conversion or convergence. And it's gone on for 10 years. This is its 10th year in New York.
I guess I was aware of it, but it's really picked up steam. You're going to have, let's just say at the outset, I want to talk some about your own background and that kind of thing, but I wonder, it's picked up, you're expecting something like some thousands of people to attend over the 3 days?
Right.
And that's a lot of folk.
It's a lot of people. It's the largest gathering of the progressive left spectrum of activists, social movement organizers, academics, and young folks and all folks in the country. It's the largest one of its type that goes on yearly, and it's this tradition in New York that's happened at the universities where it started really at the CUNY Graduate Center 10 years ago, arising out of the Socialist Scholars, which itself was a conference that had the illustrious history of 21 years at BMCC and so on.
I used to go all the time. They had it downtown often at the college downtown. Manhattan. They often had it there, and I associated with Seymour Melman and Stanley Aronowitz, and a lot of very, very good people. It was a continuation of that, but it's picking up steam, and it's now becoming a major event in terms of on a national or even internationally recognized standard. It must be interesting to be part of such an illustrious gathering of people that's getting a real reputation around the world now.
It's an incredible privilege to have been the coordinator of this conference, to have been asked to do it, and took up this role, which, by the way, is a very involving role because it's an all-volunteer effort from the 1,300 speakers who are coming out and workshop conveners this year, and panel organizers and workshop organizers and artists and event producers, to the core of about 50 people who are also volunteers and interns and others, to the board members. You mentioned Stanley Aronowitz, who was one of the founders, along with Frances Piven and a number of other people.
Frances Fox Piven.
That's right.
I love Frances Fox. She went in through the window at Columbia back at with Mark Rudd. They closed the university down.
Through the window.
She's going, right. Okay. That was the good old days.
Yeah.
At that time, I was teaching at Long Beach in your state of California. I've heard you were from there. And with the people that we were involved in, we closed down the University of Long Beach at California that involved the input of Mr. Reagan himself, who was then the governor of the state of California. Those were heady times back in 1968-70, weren't they?
Well, just to Left Forum.
I'm sorry, I didn't get off on that.
No, that's it's wonderful. That's it. The history of those two individuals is the extraordinary. You could twin pillars of this progressive left radical imagination in politics, and those are only two of 1,300 people, many of whom have done this over time, and all of whom have wonderful stories to tell. They will be, and they don't just convene to tell people, they convene sessions that are workshops that are participatory, where multiple people and everybody who comes will engage. It may be in strategy, it may be on particular campaigns, or it may be general thinking about the future and what's to be done. It could be ecological, it could be in the areas of the social movement struggles, political economy, class, you just name it. Every tendency that one could imagine or even not dream of it comes to the Left Forum now each year and brings the networks in there, and all, as I said, it's a volunteer effort, it's a convergence that you can see the dynamic, not because one or another of us is organizing, but because it has this attraction and appeal right away that when one thinks about left, that can be a term that connotes fear if you go to the mainstream media and politics where, you know, these 10 or 5-second or millisecond sound bites now throw out the, you know, accusatory tones of don't be anything but some sort of vaunted middle. But you put left and forum together, a place of dialogue, a place of understanding and discussing of differences, that indeed happens. And I see it resonate over the 7 years. This is my 7th year doing it that I've done this.
7 years now.
Yes.
I wonder if we could back up a little bit and just hear, I know you're out of California from pre-taping, pre-running tape. So maybe share a little of your own background. You were a sociologist by profession, and you were an academic, and maybe a little of your own background, and then we'll get into the forum in depth. In that.
Sure. I guess I've, you know, experienced a fairly diverse life, which has been a wonderful thing. And so in a young age, I took up the guitar, I'd say 5 or 6 or something like that. Now, my parents were, you know, politically engaged and really supportive. No, they were very supportive of that.
No, I was just seeing a 5-year-old twanging on a guitar.
Absolutely.
I had visions around the table. And
And, you know, enjoying that and then joining, you know, sort of other friends and people I met. You know, my own trajectory was unusual in that is that I went into, you know, soul music, blues, a bit of jazz, and even though rock and roll was, you know, in full force in the late 60s and 70s, I was a very young kid traveling around to a lot of the African American and black community churches.
That's where things were really happening musically.
Yeah, playing in the prisons, playing even on military bases. We played many around the country, Hawaii, and it was very exciting. And we had this, you know, dynamism that, you know, really influenced my life. You know, W.E. Du Bois talks about double consciousness and of, you know, being black in white America, the impossibility sort of, and then you have to live it. And it's really in many ways my own upbringing was being in communities of color from a very young age.
Lucky fellow.
I was wonderful, you know, and learning, you know, sort of a perspective of those white friends I had, many friends and so forth. You know, I lived in different lives and felt those different ways as a young person of 12, playing at clubs and stuff like that. It was.
You were gigging at 12 in clubs?
Yeah.
With liquor and stuff?
No, we were at the military clubs where we could. They had rules to do. 12 and 13, we were, but we did. You know, at a very young age, there were allowances at the military clubs for young people to play music.
Right.
And that's
and
what
your family was progressive politically and so forth?
They were quite. I was lectured on in a very supportive and sensitive way on Karl Marx at age 3. I was literally on my father's knee, and he would, you know, basically tell me now, you know, surplus value means this. And I didn't know what he was saying, but I, you know, loved him incredibly and would listen and.
You know, I think we're soaking it up really fast. That's that coming out of the womb, boy, we're just learning like crazy, I think, you know.
Well, we are shocked, as Alvin Toffler has said, with so many inputs that it is hard to learn. It's almost like there are too many, you know, sources of information, the assault of pictures and digital media and so forth, so that you find maybe corresponding even with declines in economic and resource support for schools, especially the public school systems, is this onslaught of too much information and too much sort of visual, provocative commercialism that we wish, you know, that there are all the more opportunities to learn, but it's in this amidst a sea, I think, of very challenging forms of limited educational sort of competitive resources, comparatively speaking.
Yeah, I've had a lot of friends. I got a lot of friends, and I mean, you're going to become a friend. You maybe don't know that we're going to become friends. I know. I love the twinkle in your eye, my brother. But anyway, I had a lot of friends, and among them, I had one friend who was a friend. His name is Mark Stallman, and he happened to be an investment banker, and his dad was a sort of cyberneticist, and was in the room when about a dozen guys, about 1948, coined the term cyber. because here, this whole exponential increasing of computing capability, which is roiling everything now, it seems to me. And he had a statement that said, information overload permits pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is where you're thinking systems rather than burrowing in depth into any one aspect of reality, which you could spend a whole lifetime on the use of the pluperfect tense in one part of France, or, and it gets specialized down. And I think that in a large degree they've sort of co-opted the intellectual community through highly specializing and celebrating the specialization. They divided everything down into little subcategories that people become very, 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 very expert on. But pattern recognizing is where you take into account. I think they ought to have a university, at the university, they ought to have a department of everything. Because everything is interconnected, from the physics of the universe to everything. And there's not very much inclusion or thinking, or there'll be intellectualizing going on at the conference and so forth, but they become specialized in one aspect of it. What do you think of that? Do you think we may be coming to where you can really have a take on the whole universe in a new kind of way or something in our time? Or what is your thought on the large pattern?
It's nice to make a connection with the Left Forum, because in some sense, the questions you ask, the issues you probe, and you'll be presenting there too, are reflected or refracted throughout the 4,000 or more people who come.
4,000?
Yes, they're engaged in dialogues in the hallways, in the outdoor commons. It's at John Jay at 524 West 59th, right across the street.
Clips,
and it's reflected in the conversations in the lounges and in the other areas, in the cafeteria where one can eat and just, sort of enjoy the ongoings. And since there are 60 sessions, there are 400 panels and events going on every 2 hours throughout, from Friday through Sunday evening. And then there are these big sessions that we'll talk about with featured speakers who are, renowned in their own right. This type of dialogue is multiplied in thousands of ways. People meet people from other parts of the country and the world that some of, people who say, let's get together and just talk out here, or let's have a meeting here. From union groups to others, they come together at Left Forum and they utilize the space, which is one of the purposes, is to open it up in ways that it can be really productive to the needs of the community organizations and the scholars and the many activists who come, whether it was years ago when Occupy was in full swing, and then after those months, Left Forum opened up with a theme. It has a theme every year. That year was Occupy the System, speaking of system thinking, confronting global capitalism. And from Alaska to Europe to South America, occupiers came to the Left Forum. That year included speakers like Michael Moore, who really, built up the crowd and the sport of it. But it also had the General Assemblies, the Occupy Think Tank, Occupy Poetry going on amidst, again, 400 events and panels. So very exciting. To get back to your point about, systems thinking and the multiple inputs in the holistic, one can say, everythingism, as we say.
That kind of thing. Are you going to have astrophysicists? Are you going to have people who are talking about the Big Bang? Are you talking about wormholes? Or are you sticking only to politics only left politics, and that there's sort of a blinkered view? Are you going to have any investment bankers? Are you going to have any people that involve the whole larger society of which we're a part? Or is that maybe not fair to expect? And, you could become as focused as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is focused on their concerns.
Right. So,
if you're locked into a thing left.
Last year.
Or what does it mean also? What does it mean to be progressive?
Last year, the theme was mobilizing for economic and ecological transformation.
Ecological,
so it had that element, and scientists from all the communities came from, scientists Lewontin and others who talk about evolution and have really creative sort of engagement in evolutionary theory, to climatologists and others coming to the Left Forum to discuss these issues. And the question of what does left mean, or what does Left Forum, the first thing is to think about is there's two words tied here. So it's not just left. You could have as well asked, what does forum mean? And that would have been almost as appropriate.
Mr. Socrates walking around in toga. I mean, I
exactly.
can see that,
Exactly.
Or thinking,
So combining left and forum already, in some sense, it give one an indication that this is a place for dialogue, discussion, to hear things, to do things, to create, to go on beyond it from what you've got, to prepare for it. Putting left and forum together is a very interesting way to think about the term left. Emergent in the world. Well,
go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean.
That's right. Emergent in the world, I think, as best I can tell, as the big sort of political movements of the beginning of the 20th century. These are the communists, the socialist movements, the populists and others in the United States and beyond, focused around sort of singular utopian terms, although there's a diversity of meanings and differences in those utopian terms that arose. And in some ways, the life of those terms, although populism emerges in a progressive form and also in more reactionary forms many times, the life of the terms socialism and communism have ebbed and flowed, and at the turn of the century into the 21st century, they in many ways lost sort of traction in the everyday life and institutions of people. Not that the potentials of what they could become lost traction, but generally losing traction like that. The word left emerged in Europe, in parties building in South America, in Central America, and elsewhere, started rising with combining more terms. Pluralism, the Bolivian state, the plurinational state of Bolivia, almost by name says we have diversity, we have tolerance, we have multiplicity. We also have elements of socialism, but not socialism in any one mold. We are of a left spectrum of politics, but you can replace one with the other and not necessarily look for the essence of a description or a meaning to a term. When the Bolivian vice president came to Left Forum last year, this is Alvaro Garcia Linera. Yes, it was his 5th year at PACE, this wonderful site. And he spoke about the rising of the movements, the idea that revolutions could take place in a sense, in ways that you're not always aware of, that relate to ecology, that relate to the struggle just to drink some water. By the way, the theme for the Left Forum this year relates to sort of those challenges, the ecological and also the revolutionary in many respects. It's reform and or revolution, with a subtitle, Imagining a World with Transformative Justice. It's a big moniker there, but reform and a revolution, if one thinks about it, why a theme like that at this time? Does revolution or transformative justice make any sense now?
I think it does make sense. The only question in my way of thinking, if I may, is transformative at what level? As I know, you did sociology, I guess. That seems to be linked at the hip with anthropology and having concern with the human condition on a large scale. But it seems to me that we now understand things in a way that we haven't out of history. And history's been over 200,000 years we're here as a species, I guess. We emerged 200,000 years ago, 10,000 generations. I did a program with Isaac Asimov once, and he's a giant, a great sense of humor, a wonderful human being, wrote all the laws of robotics. But he did make a point. He's talking about now, this time, you and I sit and talk. Think 10,000 generations. He's making a premise. And he said this, and I think he was talking about this general period of time, right? This is the defining generation. Not in a political sense of, a Democrat, Republican, or tax cut or whatever, and all the argumentation that's gone on about how the system's going to be organized, but in an evolutionary context. The thing that we're going through is coming, we're coming not just to a political context, but one that is totally inclusive, like punctuated equilibrium that Eldridge, Niles Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould would talk about. We're coming to an end of the extension of human consciousness to make the world different in an Eden-like sense, is the way most creatures encounter the environment. So the political context is one that was always done within a system of the thing we're talking about this year is transcending material scarcity, which seems kind of ipso facto absurd. At the left forum, because it's the only place where they would introduce such a thing, because it's ipso facto absurd. Everybody knows there's not nearly enough. There's not enough, and that's been the premise that is held realistically throughout the whole of 10,000 generations. There was not, in fact, enough between the liaison, between all the resources that were here when we came out of the cave, and the ability of us to have self-reflective consciousness to ask the bigger questions, like you do at the forum or in the intellectual enterprise, but also in the ability to extend consciousness and make the world other than, in an Eden-like sense, we're capable of doing. Big difference between wandering around, sheltering in a cave, you find, and building a house with air conditioning.
It's great how you're waxing poetic on the idea of transformation or transformative
at a comprehensive level. You don't. Are we ever going to get to a point where there's something where it's the left and right, and these are reified institutions out of history, and they go way back to Rome, really, in the hereditary families in Europe. And it was all, whoever had the biggest club could hit the others on the head, rule, set up a propaganda machine to make their system right. It's called realpolitik. It still rules. And we're coming to the end of it at an evolutionary sense, not just a political sense, is what I'm trying to get at. And that would mean you'd have to be able to have something that's going to be able to include the far right, the far left, and all in between in a major transformative movement like punctuated equilibrium, coming into a new relationship in the cosmos that is not just within the Homo sapien bailiwick, that these reified institutions that we're talking about are being argued about or discussed.
I tend, like as we've talked about, with a certain anti-authoritarian streak, and even for want of a better word, sort of the postmodern sensitivities that I've encountered, later in my life, to be much less sort of sure of any fixed answers or any sense of reification.
It's a synergetic universe.
Therefore, I qualify, just my opinions and my, with sort of thoughts and hopes, and see a certain, as you say, synthesis and synergy and combination. So I tend not to go towards single answers or sort of that this is the essence of the matter, so forth. And yet on the other side, the importance of not giving up, of not basically abdicating to apathy or some sort of nihilism. It's very important at the same time, I hope, to balance the combination of being skeptical, of not catering to more sort of authoritarian types of answers or certainty in that way, but at the same time struggling always for a certain certainty in life of political commitment, of cultural commitment, of engagement in the world and trying to change it, being humble enough in many ways not to think that this is the particular time that it will happen, although to hope that there are times. I've had the great privilege in Left Forum for almost 7 years of seeing every single almost imaginable activist and cultural and political and intellectual current come through there. It humbles me to have been able to do this with the thousands of volunteers that I've worked with and helped to organize and in turn been organized through. And in all of that, what I learn is there's so much to be positive and to sort of celebrate and to see the potentials, even with great shocks and assaults to the potential for a freer, a more equal, a more resource-supported world. Whatever terms you want, they don't have to last that long. It's just as good in the movements that have come up, the great black freedom struggle, the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the student activist movement, that there was a multiplicity of ideas in terms.
Came around about in 1970 was
That's
a
right.
magic moment.
And
there
at the
was
same
something going on beyond sex, drugs, and rock and roll, wasn't there?
Well, at the same time, there were these revolutionary tendencies in all of them, and at the same time, there were divisions and separations, and we could say the older left and socialist and communist organizing forms were not that durable in mass scale at that point, and yet they were filtering through and influencing and taken through. That sort of set of great movements, also called social movements, has separations and differences in it. So you would have leaderships with certain folks who were felt as the authentic leaders and others who could never be authentic. So there was a certain abnegation of the other on the outside, that you always had to watch out that the other of a certain race, a certain gender or something was not in the inside. Those are some of the great challenges of the dynamic movements for equality, parity of power, for cultural diversity. All of those elements moved forth, and these are the currents that come to the Left Forum, and people are concerned with greater unity, greater connection, greater networking. There are multiple ways that one thinks about this, and even through, the 2 years ago when we talk about the Occupy movements and the forms that those took in the anti-authoritarian communities that thought, dreamed of them, the religious justice communities that I was a part of when I was doing my peace and justice and peace and human needs work, whether it was the American Friends Service Committee, Fellowship of Reconciliation, all of these groups had a style of creating equality of voice that took some of these social movements with great honor, and at the same time said, really nobody needs to be on the outside. We need to find the forms where political, cultural, and community voice is equalized at some level. It was called the General Assembly here at Zuccotti, but in 1,000 other places, and the same General Assemblies at Left Forum were active too, where you see that you don't need the words left, socialist, communist. You say punctuated equilibrium, or we can say a zero growth economy. Not any single term is going to do it. In this case, horizontalism, forms of democracy that were plural, respected every voice in many respects, took all of these currents and created forms of equality and political control over one's own community that we saw. Left Forum is a voice for all of these places with desire, which is very far from reach in many senses, for broad-based type of egalitarian unity. Though that desire is expressed at Left Forum and 1,000 other places, because when 1,300 speakers and workshop conveners come, there is a story of each of them on what they're struggling, whether it's immigration rights, it's against sexual assault, it's against police militants, all of these things, or it's for the transformations of those institutions from within, thinking about how to build left formations, political parties, horizontal general assemblies, participatory democracy. These are all there. And I should probably not forget to mention who the speakers are that may attract some of your listeners.
Yeah, let's do that. And I'm sorry to get off on that track and everything, but that's all well put. And all of our spiritual leaders have more or less questioned authority. I mean, from Jesus to Buddha to Martin King and Gandhi and all the Spartacus and so forth, who riled against the injustices and so forth throughout the ages, in which we can draw upon, plus our great intellectual and philosophical leaders over the centuries we do. But let's get down to talking about the forum itself. It's being held, let's just say for the audience who's viewing, it's being on the weekend coming up, right?
Coming up after Memorial Day weekend, which is right now, basically the next weekend, May 30th through June 1st, right across the street at John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the City University of New York. This conference starts at 2 in the afternoon, and this is Friday, and people can come in. It's the the largest yearly, or one of the largest yearly book and grassroots organization fairs in the region. So to greet you right when you're there at 2 o'clock, you can see whether it's Verso Books or it's PM Press or AK Press or Haymarket, all of those wonderful outfits. They're there, and they're engaged, of course, in panels and workshops too. And so at Friday, one comes in, one can go to the cafeteria and enjoy. There's beautiful outdoors commons there.
Yeah, it's
and
a
one
brand new building.
That's right. One can prepare for the opening plenary. There are workshops starting at 5 to 6:45 in that session, which have speakers who've probably been on your show, like Carl Hart, who's the neuroscientist who speaks on the need for tolerance in the decriminalization of drugs and so forth. Immortal technique.
That seems to be emerging.
Tom Hayden is being Skyped in and so forth.
Poor Huron statement.
And also there will be a number of other workshops. The U.S. Social Forum and the Left Forum are both wonderful forums in this country, and so folks from the Social Forum who are organizing it for next year will be holding a convergence there and doing breakout sessions. There's also an engendering hip-hop panel, a wonderful hip-hop. This is this group of panels before the big opening plenary. Engendering. And the way they spell it is this.
Oh, right. They would come up with something creative, those hip-hop guys.
END, gendering. So it's a wonderful postmodern spin. It's both engendering. When we engender, we take something in and we think about it. And also engendering, you think about it in terms of gender. What goes on in American pop culture and music that creates rigid, if not utopian and very desired gender images? Engendering hip-hop realizes and discusses these titles, but it also is END, gendering, to see the end of the hyper sort of masculinist and also the hyper forms of heteronormativity that Judith Butler and others have talked about. This is in popular culture. It's wonderful to see these coming through. There's also a group that talks about a new monetary theory, doing a panel event. And then
Rick Wolf is going to be talking.
Rick Wolf is there. That's right.
Rick Wolf is really, and Richard Wolf is part of the faculty here at MNN now.
Yeah,
public access. He's got a very good program running here now.
He's one of the.
And in fact, the day after this program that you and I are playing now on the Tuesday, it's going to be a repeat of a program with Richard Wolf we did back in 2007.
Wonderful.
He's a brilliant fellow.
He's one of the board members of the Left Forum, along with Stanley Aronowitz, and he's doing a standalone event with Laura Flanders, Cornel West, Chris Hedges, and Rick Wolf. What are they talking about? The anatomy of revolution. Who are they focusing on? It's a 10-part series kicked off at the Left Forum. Thomas Paine, Common Sense. What can we take out of Thomas Paine's amazing writings from back then that may have some importance today when the structures of power, money, and culture are quite different from those times? So that's one panel.
There's a whole bunch. And listen, we have a couple of clips. Didn't you bring in a couple of clips? Would this be a time?
I brought in 2 clips that show the opening plenary.
Maybe we could show those now or at that time, because these are announcing some of the things, the actual main events that are going on at that. So again, let's see if we can't bring. Shall we just do one right after the other, maybe?
Yeah, they're the plenaries that give the names of the speakers, and since I haven't said them yet, it's a wonderful entree. It's a wonderful lead-in. Hear from them. Yes.
Okay, let's see. Malik, maybe you could set that up and just run one, and then follow it right with the other, and we'll run them both, and it's all at the.
It's time for connection between corporate greed on Wall Street and corporate greed in the military-industrial complex. We're concerned about corporate greed in the corporate media complex, where we get a truncated discourse between mean-spirited Republicans and spineless Democrats. mainstream media says, well, can you reduce it down to 1 or 2 demands? I said, we tired of your technocratic expectations. We don't have just 1 demand or 2 demands. We want a new world.
So many people talk about the main thing the movement, the Occupy movement has done. Well, I think one of the main things we've done globally is make democracy a question. And not a question of, oh, we need more representative democracy and framing it in that way, but people seeing that more and more, that we can't have democracy with capitalism.
If we're really going to conduct a revolution, let's not make the same mistakes that we did in the past. Let's not keep repeating history. Let's not throw out a dictator and install some military flunky of his like they're going to do in Egypt. I mean, can we do better than that? Can the revolution not betray itself constantly?
If we're going to rebuild the left, I argue, we need to recreate those institutions that take care of people's needs, not simply do protest and resistance. We used to call it in the 1960s in the New Left, we called it prefigurative activity. That is something that prefigures what we want as life. And so the point of the left should be that we want to change.
Okay, well, there's another clip do we have?
There is, of the Saturday night event.
Well, that's really interesting. It's really good. All these friends of mine, you keep coming up, and it's going to be friends of a lot of people, and that's really interesting. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, while we're in this vein, there is another clip that is talking about it. This was talking about the opening session at 2 o'clock on Friday, right?
By the way, Harold, isn't that a wonderful title? It's a title of 2 questions that Cornell, Stanley Aronowitz, Marina Citrin, Immortal Technique with Amy Goodman convening and moderating are going to address. The opening question that they'll address for the whole conference that focuses on this reform and or revolution, imagining world transformative justice. Their question to address is, why revolution now? What revolution now? And if you think about that, there's an ambiguity in that second question, but there's an imperative.
Yeah, there's an opening on synergy. Synergy behavior systems unpredicted by the sum of the parts. There's something resonating more than the sum of the parts. Fuller used to introduce that term to scientists. He would say, has anybody heard of synergy? And nobody would put their hand up. Now it's on every ad agency's lips because it's operative in universe at all levels, including our politics. There's something more than the sun. And there are no absolutes in an ultimate sense, because there will be a resonancy of a liberated order that will interaccommodate us to the universe, transcendent to what we've been for 200,000 years of human existence on this planet.
A certain relativity of everything, which is what you talk about. And the ambiguity, one thinks, so this left forum gathering, there should be no ambiguity, it should be clear. No, that's the whole point, is the ambiguity of what revolution now? Are we all going for one meaning or multiple meanings? At the same time, do we say, why now? Why at this point now? And if you take your friends Stanley Aronowitz and Cornel West and Marina Citrin and also Immortal Technique, these are wonderful minds. They really engage these topics and they become issues like, so the challenge, the great advances from the New Deal, of reforms, of the great compromises, of the social compact, of the acceptance of, the struggles of labor and the black freedom and civil rights and feminist movements, in some ways into, everyday politics and policies that have realized not just policy and not just forms of compromise, but it also built up structures that have sustained human beings in nutrition, in education, in justice, in all of these areas, and also to some degree in politics. But over the last 100 years, as these Cornell and others will say, really since the New Deal and before the New Deal, there has been an erosion, not just of the ecology that sustains the earth, but an erosion of the liberal and the policy promises of these approaches. And so now we find communities, since the Great Recession, now we find communities of 2008, the Great Recession.
Well, the Great Recession was 1929.
That's right, that's a depression, and this is so-called a recession. But the level of income, which you mentioned, Richard Wolff and other economists, Garo Purovitz, and all of those who come to the Left Forum, you know, these conditions have degraded everyday life in homes, in families, in stressed debt forms, in public health. Everywhere you go, the public systems find little ways to move 2 steps forward rather than 20 back with the liberal dream and the liberal promises that we've all wanted. The question of revolution compared to reform is one that's vital to pose, because it's not just at the level of the social networks and the social goods that have been degraded and challenging with victories that are all too rare for the majority of peoples. It's not just that brings one to question, why talk revolution now? It's also the fact that the very ecology that sustains the earth is compelling even the most moderate, regardless of libertarian or socialist or anarchist or any form or moderate form of identification, to think we know at some level transformational and revolutionary action and thinking connected with it is necessary, but it is very difficult in these institutions to move the one step forward. So the challenge, just to say, of why revolution now, what revolution now, is to get those discussions framed and going for the whole weekend at Left Forum through the thousands of people who are there.
Yeah, well, that's all very, very good. It's just a question of what it is. I've noted that there's a robotics thing going on where the production is being taken over by not only information technology, which can be just very, if we were to allow it to really fullest potential, be massively disruptive in terms of labor's productive input. And the robotics are coming on top of that exponentially, so that the underpinnings of being realistically relating to, in a realistic way, to the world of the labor theory of value, which informs in many people's mind, or the surplus labor theory of value, that all capital instruments is congealed labor and stolen, and should eliminate it and so forth, is now running into a thing where they have a tremendous productive capability. Nanotechnology is just over the horizon. These things have come. And all the assets, I notice, are all owned by a very tiny plutocratic class. The amount of equilibrium in terms of wealth and income in the world is at an all-time great differentiation. And by our saying, is clinging to the labor theory of value without saying, it's like being a serf on a feudal estate. They have all they have the castle, they have all the power. They're the kings in the castle, the people who have the ownership of the assets, and we will be laborers, like serfs. And they're sticking with that, and I think the blame should be spread around. It's not just the greedy capitalists are doing that. The people who are trying to change things are doing it by sticking to a labor theory of value with no way of attaching. I see Laura, what's her name, Grit TV?
Flanders.
She came up the other day with something interesting. She says ownership of a productive asset, a robot. If you own a piece of a robot, you get income for that. And that's something we can't do because you have to be a worker. And I think it's an outdated thing. We should be able to hoist the establishment or the capitalists on their own petard, and we should be able to hoist the left on their petard, because the blame goes all over, and it finally comes down to the intellect. We have no systems thinkers about the combination of things in a way that begins to involve the fact that we have transcended material scarcity and we're coming into a new ontologic reality in the universe. Never voiced. But that's what, and Fuller, if I may, a major comprehensive thinker, there have been some, but they're very isolated. Everybody's specialized. What we really need is he did a thing in Design Science Decade, 65, 75. He measured these kind of things. And what we really need is the means by which we know what the hell is going on evolutionarily and have an operating manual for spaceship Earth that is able to understand what's really going on, rather than all these reified institutions out of history that we're dealing with, and the fighting out of history in an era where we got the ability now, since about 1970, to wipe out the entire Homo sapiens species with our realpolitik thing, our view of the world and political legitimacy being established. And on the other, we have a technologically augmented capability of providing overwhelmingly ecologically inclusive capability that we have transcended scarcity as an ontologic reality. It never can be mentioned because you've got to be reifying the fight between all the institutions that are based on scarcity primarily. It is not enough. There's not nearly enough for one to win, somebody else has to lose. And that kind of fighting goes on because we don't have an overall system that can relate to everybody. And the intellectuals are falling down on the job, I would submit.
It's wonderful that the conversation that you are bringing to the Left Forum, of which you're articulating part of, is also provoked by the themes and by the purposes of people coming together to discuss these things and work together and listen and respect the different views, and also think about how do we get into action? How do we actually build up institutions where even the cement under our feet is controlled by so many codes and ways and laws of being that the public is no longer really the public anymore.
Those are inherited institutions that we've got to be able to see another order of things. That's what I'm saying. The intellectuals are, where are the systems thinkers about it thinking on an evolutionary scale, not a merely dialectical materialism understanding of history? We got all kinds of institutions that are outdated. And we got a new future that's coming. The assets are all only by a tiny plutocratic class everywhere, and we won't have anything to do. Laura did say, you got to start spreading some ownership. This guy named Louis Kelso, he had a book called The Capitalist Manifesto, which is probably something that the left should be paying attention to as a way to bring capitalism up on its own petard. And then there should be something coming to put the left, the capitalists up on their own petard. There should be something on the left to put the left up on their own petard for being so blinkered. That's my suggestion, for whatever it's worth.
My confidence is that at Left Forum, of one of many places of convergence and thinking about these issues and acting on these issues, is that there's so many multiplicities of views, and there's a desire for greater unity and greater momentum in the change of
in the fight against the bad guys. Well, it's like going to war.
Amongst many things.
And that's too limited. You should have some people from the Heritage Foundation. You have some people from the right. You should have something that can appeal to a comprehensive understanding of things, rather than going along with dialectical materialism or however you interpret history. History is a nightmare from which we're awakening, said Mr. Joyce.
So it's good that this has provoked a discussion, and in many senses, terms, as I said early on, with a more postmodern or anti-authoritarian orientation, I generally am very skeptical on anything being what it seems to be. So the right, or the left, or the Marxists, or the libertarians,
but the left,
generally, well, no, I don't necessarily, not in the way, I'm very, imagine being at a place where thousands of people come every year for many days and work through things, and there is a lot of throwing around of terms for people to want to feel certainty that there are solutions, but in many senses there are problems with feeling certainty, because in many ways it can polarize it within oneself, the very potential to realize that your certainty is closing you out from understanding that there may be no certainty in the world, but you still struggle for that. So the idea of the left and the right, in some ways, is a problematic term, because in many respects, the fragmentation of the social movements, of the political activists, of the unions and the feminist movements and so forth, the fragmentation of the communist and socialist parties out there, all relatively small, all also beleaguered by the economic assaults, the cultural, the commercial capitalist assaults and so forth. All of these forms, the surveillance assaults and the militarism that we are finding in our institutions, helps to, develop a sense of great fragmentation. So when somebody says the left, I say, who usually says the left? Bill O'Reilly, Rush Limbaugh, those folks are spitting out these terms. They have a really good base of material resources in a more white and institutionally corporate America. Yeah. So with those resources supporting them, they can spit out those terms more, and it gets many people scared that means one thing, that there is a the left, but there isn't necessarily a the left or a the right. There is great fragmentation and isolation, and even the ability when one works 2 or 3 jobs a day to think about being political within one's own family, let alone within one's own school. It's a tremendous leap, and it's a wonderful leap that many people take, but it will not be televised, so to speak, as Gil Scott Heron said. Yeah. And that's one of the things that what's televised are these stereotypes of the left. Back then it's the communists, or it's the Black Panthers, the Black Freedom Movement. It's these overstatements to use fear that in many ways I try at least not to cater to as much. Good. So at the very place where you think there would be dialectical materialism in hegemony, there is pluralism, there is ecumenical relationships, and there is very open work, even with all of the folks that you might think constitute the left. So revolutionary organizations come to the Left Forum. These are organizations that are both anti-authoritarian, socialist, communist, and in many traditions, feminist, socialist. The thing about these groups is they generally put their recruiting hats at the door. Well, okay, and they're not even saying the left there. People come in and say, this is time when, whether it's the Internationalist Socialist Organization, or it's the Workers' World, or it's the Socialist Party, this is a time where we can speak to each other a little bit more about what it's like to be in a revolutionary group at very hard times, to be able to bring up that commitment and live that commitment, where some of us may, as orators, use the term the left, but we know the great fragments mean that it may end up being that, as in Occupy, horizontalism and participatory democracy, maybe the demons later on, it's like the participatory democracy, the horizontalism, and yet if you extrapolate and see of these movements moving into the communities, and Left Forum is in the community and brings communities in within, whether it's the Department of Education, the Department of Health, where they're very hierarchical forms, state, party, capital, you see these forms of great hierarchies solidifying and narrowing in these realms. The other side of this is these terms, the participatory democracy and the horizontalism, in many ways are ways that flatten that hierarchy at the very base. And in Latin America, in other parts of the world, where these forms are so much more developed in the industries that workers cooperate and control, in the bazaars and markets that they control. Mondragon, and in Bolivia we've got many of the indigenous movements that have the farming cooperatives. So these forms of relating to each other and hearing all's voices have leveled authority and leveled capital and leveled state and party and military in ways that haven't been done here, but indeed they could be. It gets voice at the Left Forum, and it's one of those places where that builds, and it gets respect.
That's wonderful. I just know all capital is still being formed, where there's a lot of past savings, and that the only way they can see to distribute demand effectively to the public is through what they call labor or jobs, and they're still arguing that, and it's not going well for the less well-advantaged people of the world, and it has to be in touch with the way things are being actually produced rather than through the labor theory of value. Labor theory of value still holds. A job, and people's identities are wrapped up in those roles. So it's a big transformation, you're right, and it is synergetic, so it means that the uncertainty principle holds and we don't know where to go. There's an old Scottish thing. I'm a Scottish background. We don't know where we're going, but we're on our way. We'll be getting to a point where we'll launch off into not just a political change with the good guy or the righteous cause, but it is transformative of the entire ecology, the entire Homo sapiens species, liberated in a way that has no precedent in history. We're surrounded by outdated, reified institutions that we have to incorporate, subsume some way, and then move on. And that's the overall charge of the forum, it seems to me. That other clip you had, how long was that?
That's just a minute and a half.
A minute. You would think we should maybe get it in?
Yeah,
a little pitch for the speaker.
Speaking of some of the issues you're talking about.
Yeah, but there's a tyranny in television. We're running short of time. Shall we run that clip now?
Yeah.
Madeline, can you set up that other clip? And we're talking here, with Seth Adler about the Left Forum coming up almost just a couple days after this program is aired. Everybody should get out to it because it's a real source of crowd gathering on very, very important issues with people that are seriously concerned. If we can run that clip, we got just about time to fit it in, or maybe it's not going to be. Yeah, is that the same one, or is that different? Back. Okay, that's good. They could register. You can register online, leftforum.org.
And at the door.
And at the door as well. You can do that. And so people are encouraged to come because it's a place where there's serious thinking going on. And it's a wonderful institution that's been 10 years now. Mm-hmm. Congratulations
the 10th year.
On that. Do you have any idea where you're going to hold next year?
Left Forum has been at Pace University many years, and it goes there and can go there. But John Jay is this new setting, sort of coming home to the CUNY system.
Bring it here. It's right across the street from Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Yeah. We're sister-brother institutions, and there should be some connection there.
Let's just mention that, they can go online at Left Forum and read about all the workshops and panels. There's a concert tribute to Pete Seeger. There's comedy.
I love Pete Seeger.
Yeah, there's comedy, there's the Yes Men, there's also, as we said, the speakers Angela Davis, Harry Belafonte, David Harvey on Saturday night, and on Sunday night Amy Goodman comes back to moderate a wonderful panel with plenary with audience participation with the newly elected socialist city councilor of Seattle, Sharma Sawant, along with Barbara Bowen of New York fame here, the president of the PSC, and Rob Robinson, one of the board members of Left Forum, who founded Take Back the Land.
Are you going to be presenting, my brother? Are you going to be giving a plenary session or something? Or are you going to be giving a keynote address or something? Because you could. You're really good.
Wouldn't it be wonderful to organize this conference where it's a grassroots, almost no budget, all in kind, takes all of my energy and hundreds of other people's energy.
Congratulations on all that. It's your pleasure presenting a really good guy. Haven't been able to get anything in like the depth we would like to, and I hope it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Everybody should get out to the conference later this week. Go leftforum.org. You can get all the details and so forth. And it's right across the street from our Manhattan Neighborhood Network. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming in and filling some of the details. And it's a great place to be. A lot of energy. They could bottle that energy by the end of the energy crisis if we could. Thanks for viewing. We'll be coming back again tomorrow. And Seth, thanks a lot for coming in.
Thank you.
All the best for the conference.
Thank you, Harold. It's been great getting things started.
Yeah, get the ball rolling. Okay.